The drinking songs were light-hearted but bitter compensation for serving on a jeep carrier. All the glory, as well as most of the creature comforts, went to the pilots in the Big Blue Fleet, the real Navy. In the pilot-ready rooms of the sweatbox CVEs, temperatures could reach 100 degrees. Returning from their largely uneventful missions on October 24th, the pilots aboard the carriers of Taffy 3 had heard the reports from the Sibuyan Sea of battleships sunk by the rich kids, as the Taffy pilots referred to their Third Fleet counterparts. Once again, the Taffys were left to the unglamorous work, flying air cover over tin carriers that were hardly worth trying to sink. Taking off on a routine patrol before dawn on October 25th, Ensign Bill Brooks's Avenger was armed with depth charges for submarines, not bombs or torpedoes for surface ships. Brooks expected to look at an empty ocean through the broken clouds, then head back for a sorry breakfast of powdered eggs. At about 6:40 a.m., as dawn lightened the sky, he steered around a large squall and looked down to see ships. Many ships, including some very large ones. Destroyers, cruisers, battleships. "Hey, look at that!" Brooks called out to his gunner and radio man. Halsey must have come down from the north. But Brooks paused to wonder where Halsey's carriers were. He did a double take. The ships didn't look American. They had the distinctive pagoda superstructures of the Japanese. He quickly began to count. At 6:43 a.m., Brooks excitedly radioed Taffy 3. Nemi surface force of 4 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 10 to 12 destroyers sighted 20 miles northwest of your task force and closing in on you at 30 knots. Aboard his flagship, the Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague was annoyed. Now there, he thought, is some screwy young aviator reporting part of our own forces. "Air plot," he ordered. "Tell him to check his identification." Just then, his radio men began to pick up a strange gabble of voices. In Japanese, apparently from enemy ships communicating by shortwave radio perhaps 20 miles away. Confirmation and a little colour for emphasis came quickly from Ensign Brooks. "I can see pagoda masts," he said. "I see the biggest red meatball flag I ever saw flying on the biggest battleship I ever saw." By now, the officers and men on the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay were looking at each other uneasily. Sprague broke the silence. "It's impossible!" he exclaimed. "It can't be! It can't be!" But now he could see for himself. Puffs of anti-aircraft fire to the northwest, and just peeking over the horizon, the distinctive pagoda shapes of the ships of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Sprague vented his anger. "Halsey, the commander of Taffy 3, spat out, has left us bare-assed. A sighted enemy is a dead enemy, was an old adage of bravado in the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was extremely rare to sight an American carrier. Indeed, the only Japanese surface ship commander who had set eyes on an American carrier was Admiral Kurita. Flying his flag from the battleship Congo, he had seen, from a distance of several miles at night, the bombed and sinking USS Hornet at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in the fall of 1942. To bring American carriers under the 14, 16, and 18-inch guns of the Japanese battleships seemed like the kind of gift from the gods most Japanese officers paid lip service to, but had trouble believing in, at least at Guadalcanal. It had been 2 years since a Japanese fleet enjoyed material superiority over the Americans. Kurita dictated a message to Combined Fleet Headquarters. "By heaven-sent opportunity, we are dashing to attack the enemy carriers. Our first objective is to destroy the flight decks, then the task force." To see for himself, Operations Officer Otani scrambled up into the crow's nest to peer over the low mist. He came down sure he had spotted 2 aircraft carriers. Kurita's staff was convinced they had stumbled upon one of Halsey's carrier groups, and that they were up against 4 or 5 fleet carriers, the Hases-class fast carriers. They could not tell, from a distance of some 20 miles, that they were looking at smaller jeep flat-tops, which had the same profile as the larger ships. Japanese ship identification was poor. In any case, Kurita's fleet had no drawings or photographs of the American CVS. An American fast carrier could move at over 30 knots. The Yamato, down at the bow from getting holed by a bomb the day before, could sail no faster than 26 knots. Another battleship, the Nagato, was a knot or two slower. Kurita felt that it was imperative to get a jump on the Americans, to head off the carriers before they could turn into the wind and launch their planes. Kurita had been bombed enough over the last 24 hours. He wanted to punch holes in the carriers' launch pads. He ordered the fleet to sail southeast, to try to cross the bows of the carriers as they swung into the northeast wind. At Etajima, the midshipmen played a game called Go. It was not so much a game as a melee. The object was to knock down the opposition's pole, and the best way to do it was simply to rush en masse. Kurita used the same tactic against the Americans. He did not form up a line of battle or try to bring his destroyers and cruisers forward to stage torpedo runs. He simply ordered general attack, in other words, every ship against any enemy ship, catch as catch can. Kurita did not act instantly. There was some confusion and hesitation on the bridge of the flagship. The fleet had just begun to shift from a spread-out night search disposition to a circular anti-aircraft formation, and there was uncertainty in the fleet as changing and sometimes conflicting signals flew back and forth. It was by now a cliché among American forces that the Japanese, rigid and often stuck on ceremony, did not deal well with surprises, and that the Japanese would be unable to improvise if their elaborate plans went awry. Fortunately for the Americans, the cultural stereotype was true. Sitting in his corner of the Yamato Bridge, watching Kurita and his staff fumble as they tried to settle on the right approach, Admiral Ugaki visibly seethed. Finally, he spoke out. "Firing should be under my command." He was the battleship division commander. He felt sidelined and useless and wanted something to do. Kurita was sensitive to his proud subordinate's vexation and told him to take over the flagship's maneuvering and gunfire. Later, writing about the battle, Ugaki somewhat stiffly vented his frustration, never mentioning Kurita by name. Ugaki wrote, "Each unit seemed very slow in starting actions due to uncertainty about the enemy condition. Actions of the fleet headquarters, i.e., Kurita, standing a few feet away, were also apt to lack promptness." The fleet's attacking directions were also conflicting, and feared the spirit of all-out attack at short range was lacking. I so advised the Chief of Staff Koyanagi. Several of the Japanese cruisers and battleships had already opened fire on the Americans. At 2 minutes before 7 a.m., Kurita ordered the flagship to open fire with its main battery of 18-inch guns, or special 16-inch guns, as they were called to keep their true size a secret. In almost 3 years of war, the guns had never been fired at the enemy. On the wing of the bridge, Petty Officer Koitabashi was told to hang on. The percussion of the great guns could knock a man down. With a thunderous roar, the mighty guns belched fire and shot projectiles weighing more than 1.5 tons apiece at the thin-skinned American carriers and their thin-skinned destroyer escorts. Koitabashi had snapped out of his grogginess. He felt thrilled watching another battleship, the Congo, steam by at nearly 30 knots, its enormous battle ensign, the rising sun, streaming in the wind. "It's just like the movies," Koitabashi thought to himself. Aboard USS Johnston, one of the 3 destroyers surrounding Taffy 3, Lieutenant Ellsworth Welch was the officer of the deck on the 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. watch. As Ood, the 21-year-old Welch, normally the ship's anti-submarine warfare officer, was responsible for the safety of the ship. A little after 6:50 a.m., he was leaning over the port wing of the bridge, smelling delightful breakfast odours wafting up from the galley, he recalled, when he suddenly saw huge geysers of salt water thrown up near a jeep carrier astern. He instinctively looked up at the sky for enemy planes and saw none. He peered out to sea. The Japanese ships were still hull down, but their masts could be seen peeking over the horizon. Over the loudspeaker inside the bridge, he heard an anxious voice announce over talk between ships that a major portion of the Japanese fleet was 15 to 20 miles astern. Commander Evans came barreling out of his sea cabin, ordering all hands to general quarters, Welch recalled. The captain barked out more orders to light off all boilers for maximum speed and to make smoke. Why didn't I think of that? Young Welch wondered, relieved to see the captain taking charge. Bob Hagan, the gunnery officer, was in the Combat Information Centre, waiting for a fried egg sandwich ordered from the galley. He had been listening, with growing apprehension, to the exchange picked up on talk between ships between Ensign Brooks, flying his Avenger 4,000 feet above the Japanese fleet, and the Taffy 3 flagship, skeptically insisting on better identification. When he heard Brooks recite 4 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers. His heart sank. As gunnery officer, he knew that his 5-inch guns fired projectiles weighing 54 pounds apiece. They would bounce off the steel plate of a battleship. I felt like David without a slingshot, Hagen recalled. At his battle station in a 40mm gun tub just in front of and below the bridge, 18-year-old Bill Mercer heard the captain call for flank speed. Thank God, Mercer thought, we're getting out of here. Then he heard the command, left full rudder. The bow of the destroyer began to swing from east to northwest, toward the Japanese fleet. Mercer pulled on his life jacket. He wondered how his mother would react to the news of his death. Clyde Burnett, the chief boatswain's mate, the senior enlisted man on the ship, was lying in his bunk when the insistent, atonal bonging of the general quarters alarm sounded. As he pulled himself up and out of his rack, he heard someone say over the PA system that the Japanese fleet was approximately 15 to 17 miles astern. Burnett thought someone was joking until he reached the deck and looked aft. The whole horizon seemed to light up from the gunfire of the Japanese ships, he recalled. Burnett knew right away, he recalled, that this was it, that the captain was going to sacrifice the ship. The Johnston began to zigzag, heeling one way, then the other, shuddering and straining, as she picked up speed and steered back around on a west-northwest course. Evans was interposing his destroyer between the enemy ships and the carriers. He wanted to lay a smoke screen in front of the carriers, but that required exposing his own ship. Men and machines balked at first. In the engine room, the order to make smoke was relayed to the fire room, where it was misunderstood. "But we're not making smoke," complained a petty officer, who was tired of being chewed out by the bridge for making too much smoke in day-to-day cruising. Charles Landreth, a sailor manning the phone to the bridge, heard Captain Evans bark, "I want a smoke screen and I want it now." The engine room began adding less air to the fuel, and the ship's 2 smokestacks funnels were soon streaming oily black clouds. In the stern, by the depth charge rack, were 4 chemical smoke-making machines. The valves on the smoke generators were stuck fast from corrosion. Someone got a wrench, and soon sulphurous white smoke was billowing aft in the ship's foaming wake. It mixed with the sooty black smoke from the funnels, and, in the humidity and light breeze, hung in a thick wreath low on the water. The chief engineering officer was unhappy. Lieutenant DeGardi, who had relieved Lieutenant Welch as officer of the deck, had ordered the engine room to mix diesel and fuel oil. At high speeds, the Johnston burned 5,000 gallons an hour, and the fuel report showed only 12,000 gallons of fuel oil remaining. DeGardi decided to dip into the 10,000-gallon reserve of diesel fuel. DeGardi wasn't sure the Johnston would last more than 3 hours, but he didn't want to run out of fuel. The chief engineer came charging to the bridge and complained to the captain that such a mixture would foul the tubes and require extensive clean-out, DeGardi recalled. Evans told him to do as he had been ordered and smiled slightly. The captain seemed amused by the engineer's fussy insistence on keeping his engines clean at a time when the Johnston was sailing into the heavy salvos of a dozen Japanese capital ships. On the bridge, Lieutenant Joe Plisker was the ship's recognition officer. He had joined the ship a few weeks earlier to instruct the men of the Johnston on spotting different Japanese ships and planes. He had never before actually seen a Japanese ship, just photographs and diagrams. Watching the pagoda superstructures rise out of the sea as the Japanese fleet emerged on the horizon, heavy-caliber guns blinking in the distance, all that young Lieutenant Plisker could splutter was "Jesus Christ." A few men on the crowded bridge joined in with expletives and oaths. They weren't sure exactly what they were looking at, but it was no secret that the main Japanese battle fleet had 2 mega battleships, larger than anything that the Americans had ever seen. Evans normally discouraged profanity on the bridge, but this time he let the cussing pass. Enemy shells were beginning to hurtle over the Johnston. From his gun tub, Mercer watched with appalled fascination as distant guns flowered with orange and yellow blooms and tiny specks rose and grew into black dots racing across the sky. The shells made a whoosh-whoosh sound as they flew overhead, he recalled. From his battle station by the depth charge racks on the stern, sailor Robert Deal was startled to see that the Japanese shell splashes were in all colours: red, orange, green, blue. He realised that shells had been tagged with dye markers to help the Japanese gunners identify where each ship's shells were landing. They were falling pretty close to a nearby carrier, the White Plains, which was being repeatedly straddled by giant sheets of coloured water. The shells that passed overhead, Deal thought, sounded like a trouser zipper opening and closing. To DeGardi and others on the bridge, the shells thundered past like freight trains. When a young sailor ducked, Captain Evans told him, "Don't duck, son. The ones you hear have already missed you." Evans went on the PA to give a situation report to the crew. He told them that units of the Japanese Navy were 15 miles away, but that he expected Admiral Halsey's forces to arrive soon. Evans did not know that Halsey was more than 6 hours steaming time distant, unaware that the Taffies were under attack. A few sailors allowed themselves to be reassured. "I thought that our planes from all our carriers would arrive any minute and begin sinking the Japanese ships," recalled Jim Carell, a spotter on a 5-inch gun. "I thought that would be interesting to see, the burning and sinking of all the Japanese ships. But fear, real fear, the grim, certain apprehension of death, was gripping most others. The crew was largely populated by teenagers who began the morning believing they were immortal and invincible. By evening, the survivors would be prematurely old men. Years later, many Johnston survivors skirted around the question of fear and did not wish to dwell on memories of the natural, profound longing of men under fire to be somewhere, anywhere else. But others acknowledged that most of the brave talk, before the battle, about wanting to see a little action was obliterated by the first salvo of 14-inch shells. Seaman Ed Takunen recalled simply thinking at the time, "I want to be home." In his recollections included in the fighting and sinking of the USS Johnston, sailor Bobby Chastain, a trainer on the crew of Gun 54, one of the 2 5-inch guns facing aft, forthrightly wrote, "One thing that should be covered right now. While on the ship during most of the battle, I was very frightened. I, along with all the other crew members, thought we would not survive against these odds, and to this day it is very difficult to understand how anyone could make it. We survivors have discussed this many times and cannot understand it. This feeling was not for just a brief moment. It was with us constantly during the 3-hour battle, easing slightly when our ship would enter a rain squall or a smoke screen, then return full force when returning to battle. During the battle, Chastain was sighting the 5-inch gun through a telescopic sight. The enemy ships looked very close, and I could see their gun flashes as they fired at us. This prompted me to close the small open-air sight door at eye level so I wouldn't have to watch. Somehow the ships seemed less real visualized through the telescopic sight than seen with the naked eye." "Psychological reaction," explained Chastain. "The reaction of Gun 54's captain, Petty Officer Bob Hollenbaugh, was blunter and earthier. Raised by straight-laced Amish in Goshen, Indiana, Hollenbaugh forgot for a moment his strict religious upbringing when he stuck his head out of the hatch of Gun 54 and saw the pagoda masts on the horizon. Years later, he recalled that his first thought was, 'Holy shit, we don't have much of a chance.'" After the Yamato fired its second salvo a minute or two after 7 a.m., the lookouts cried, "Pillar of fire." From the bridge, Chief of Staff Koyanagi thought he saw smoke broiling up from one of the American carriers in the distance. "A very great explosion," he later recalled. The carrier White Plains had been straddled, but not hit. Near misses were falling all around the Kanshaw Bay and Kalinin Bay. Aboard the Yamato, still more than 15 miles distant, the lookout and the Chief of Staff were confused by the smoke screen billowing out from the Johnston, and 2 or 3 other destroyers racing to interpose themselves between the jeep carriers and the Japanese. 10 minutes into the battle, the fog of war was already settling in. "They were shooting at us in Technicolor," shouted a sailor on the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay, Adam, Ziggy Sprague's flagship. Giant splashes of dyed water rained down in yellow and red and green on the decks of the jeep carrier. The Fanshawe Bay had been pronounced the worst ship ever seen in any navy by Taffy 3's last task group commander, Jerry Bogan. The Fanshawe Bay's crew was disgruntled and slow-moving. Their equipment was poor and the ship was dirty. The perfectionist by the book Bogan had been only too happy to get off her and take command of a fast carrier group. His successor, Ziggy Sprague, a shambling, wryly ironic New Englander, lacked spit and polish. Senior staff officers sometimes mistook Sprague's offhand manner to be sloth, even stupidity. But that was a misconception. It's true that Sprague had little time for formalities. Sprague did not waste time complaining. He did not waste time at all. Playing golf, Sprague did not pause to check the length of a putt. He just walked up and hit the ball. He had been in command of a lowly seaplane tender, the Tangier, at Pearl Harbor. His was the first ship to shoot back at the Japanese planes overhead. Sprague did not dither now. He had turned his fleet east into the wind to launch planes at 6:50 a.m., and he was hoping to slip into a squall he could see forming to the east-northeast. First, he wanted to get some planes in the air to bomb the Japanese. Some of his carrier captains complained that their planes were not properly armed with munitions to attack heavily armoured ships. Sprague cut them off. "Get the damn things up," he barked. Sprague thought his fleet could be wiped out in the next 15 minutes. Jeep carriers could make at most 18 knots. Japanese battleships, he knew, were faster, but he wanted to give the Japanese a merry chase, and he wanted to draw the Japanese away from Leyte Gulf, for a short while anyway. He was determined, he later wrote, to give them all we've got before we go down. He began giving orders to Taffy 3 ship commanders over the TBS. Amidst the excited radio chatter, his voice was relatively calm, but not everyone else was so cool. Some 30 miles to the south, Admiral Felix Stump, the commander of Taffy 2, could be heard on the TBS trying to reassure Sprague and Taffy 3. "Don't be alarmed, Ziggy," said Stump, his squeaky voice rising. "Remember, we're back of you. Don't get excited. Don't do anything rash." Stump's voice grew so high that the officers on the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay began smiling and chuckling. The comic relief was momentary as the Japanese shells continued to fall all around, ever closer. The single 5-inch guns on each carrier and the batteries of 5-inch guns on the destroyers were not likely to make much of a dent on the Japanese battleships. But the destroyers in the Taffy 3 screen did carry torpedoes, fish tipped with several hundred pounds of high explosives. The destroyer escorts in the screen had not practiced torpedo runs, as far as anyone could remember. But there was no time like the present. The destroyers would be vulnerable, and the little destroyer escorts even more so. But at 7:16 a.m., Sprague went on the TBS and gave the order to get ready. Stand by to form 2 torpedo groups, big boys destroyers, in one group, and little fellas, destroyer escorts, in another group. Aboard the Johnston, Commander Evans was not waiting. On his own initiative, before he heard Sprague's order to stand by, he had given the command to commence a torpedo run. In the defensive screen around Taffy 3, the Johnston was the closest destroyer to the advancing Japanese. By 7:10 a.m., she was less than 10 miles away from the nearest Japanese warship. Water spouts were rising all around. Shells were straddling her as the Japanese gunners narrowed their aim. Up in the cramped gun director, the claustrophobic chamber just above the bridge that controlled the aiming and firing of the 5 inches, Gunnery Officer Hagen had been feeling sickeningly impotent. He opened fire with his 5 guns at 7:10, but their total broadside weighed about 275 pounds, and with a range of under 7 miles, the shells were falling short. Lying in a bunk, recovering from his ordeal a few days later, Hagen did some math in his head. The Japanese broadsides weighed about 80,000 pounds. The only hope of sinking a Japanese ship was with a torpedo attack. Standing beside Evans on the bridge, DeGardi heard the captain say, "We can't go down with our fish." Evans was the only destroyer captain in Taffy 3 who had actually taken a torpedo run against the enemy, aboard the creaky old four-piper at the Battle of the Java Sea in the war's early days. He was bent on avenging that fiasco. Evans pointed to the nearest Japanese cruiser, which appeared to be a Tone-class 12,000-tonner, and began calling commands. The Johnston rattled and vibrated as her 60,000-horsepower twin-steam turbines pushed the long, thin hull along at 35 knots. The Johnston did not head straight for her target. She veered and fishtailed. Evans was following the splashes, steering toward the spots where shells had just landed off the ship's bow. It was the tactic he had studied from the Battle of Jutland and explained to his wide-eyed son, Ernest Jr., lightning never strikes in the same place twice. The torpedo run lasted perhaps 5 minutes and seemed like eternity. No one wanted to get too close to the onrushing phalanx of Japanese capital ships. Inside the turret of Gun 55 on the stern, the gun crew listened as Evans announced on the PA that they were going in on a torpedo run. We just looked at each other, recalled sailor William Rogers. No one spoke. Gunnery Officer Hagen recommended firing the torpedoes at 10,000 yards, 5 nautical miles from the target. Evans wanted to get in closer, to within 8,000 yards. Hagen was afraid we'd get blown out of the water before we got our torpedoes off, but he ayayed the captain. The gunnery officer was desperately trying to appear calmer than he felt. Water dyed red from a shell splash came streaming through an open hatch in the gun director. "Looks like someone's mad at us," Hagen lamely joked. No one laughed. At last, Evans shouted, "Fire torpedoes!" One by one, at 3-second intervals, 10 25-foot-long torpedoes jumped from their tubes amidships. With a whoosh of compressed air, they smacked, propellers whirring into the water. Hot, straight, and normal, called out Lieutenant Jack Bechtel, the torpedo officer. The Johnston did not wait around to watch for the impact with the torpedoes set at low speed, about 30 knots, roughly 7 minutes, but turned hard to port and disappeared into the relative safety of her own smoke screen. Intently, the officers on the bridge listened. 5 minutes, 6 minutes. Then a sonar man in the Combat Information Center excitedly yelled out, 1, then 2 underwater explosions. As the smoke parted for an instant, Lieutenant Welch thought he saw an enormous column of water rising by a distant cruiser. He was not imagining. A torpedo had ripped into the Kumano, flagship of one of Kurita's cruiser divisions. The cruiser's bow was blown off. Aboard the Yamato, lookout Koitabashi saw a lone American destroyer coming out to take on the Japanese fleet. Many years later, he recalled thinking, "My God, these are really courageous guys. We were always told that the Americans were sissies, but all of a sudden, here they are." The bravery of the American sailors was matched by the bravery of the American pilots, most of them at any rate. Lieutenant Henry Pizdrowski had climbed into his Avenger to take off from the jeep carrier Gambier Bay. Ahead of him on the catapult was Lieutenant William Gallagher. "Wait! Wait! You've got no gas!" cried a crewman. Gallagher just waved him off and gave the signal to launch. He had enough gas to last maybe 5 minutes in the air, but his was one of the few planes to be armed with a torpedo, and he wanted to use it before his own ship went down. Taking off, he did not even bother to gain altitude. Gallagher simply banked his plane and flew over the wave tops right at the Japanese. He launched his torpedo at a battleship. It missed, ditched his plane, and was never seen again. As Pizdrowski was watching this drama play out, he heard someone shouting his name. It was another pilot, his roommate, Lieutenant George Bisbee. Bisbee was standing on the flight deck, yelling at Pizdrowski to tell him the combination to his locker in the stateroom they shared. "We need a drink!" yelled Bisbee. Pizdrowski had just received a shipment of scotch from home, and it was safely secured in his locker. Pizdrowski yelled down the 3-number combination and waited his turn to take off. The giant geysers of coloured water from enemy shells were marching closer toward the Gambier Bay. Planes from the Taffies were buzzing around Kurita's ships. Interrogated after the war, Kurita's staff officers testified that they were surprised by the skillfulness of the American pilots. With few heavy bombs or torpedoes, they were dropping depth charges, anti-personnel bombs, even flares. When they had nothing to drop, some pilots opened their bomb bays and made dummy runs, firing their machine guns. Even Ugaki was forced to admit they strafed courageously, and one of our ships got as many as 500 bullets. They assaulted Yamato 4 times too, but Ugaki wrote loftily, "I didn't pay too much attention to them." With the big guns of the Yamato once again under his command, Ugaki was absorbed with trying to sink American ships. Ugaki claimed to have destroyed a ship with the Yamato first 2 or 3 salvos. He, too, had been fooled by the smoke. But at a little after 7:30 a.m., Japanese salvos finally did connect. The men and officers of the Johnston barely had time to celebrate their successful torpedo run when the Japanese shells struck home. 3 14-inch shells, probably from the battleship Congo, slammed into the aft engine room and fire room. The explosion rolled the ship over so far that William Rogers, loading 5-inch shells onto a hoist under gun 55 in the stern, thought the Johnston had been struck by a giant wave. At the depth charge rack, sailor Robert Deal thought the ship must have run into some huge underwater obstruction. To Hagen, the jolt was like a puppy smacked by a truck. Sailor Joseph Check was supposed to be manning a 20mm gun amidships on the starboard side. but without any airplanes to shoot at, he was taking cover near a first aid station. The concussion from the Japanese salvo lifted him off his feet. His helmet struck an overhang and he fell to the deck. Woozily rousing himself, he saw 3 men emerge from a hatchway to the engine room and lie against the bulkhead. The men, members of the engine room black gang, were turning a ghastly white and swelling. Their skin was peeling off in sheets. Steam-broiled, all 3 men were soon dead. With superheated 840-degree steam blasting below, no one else made it out of the wrecked engine room. Within 10 seconds of the salvo, 3 6-inch shells from a light cruiser ripped into the superstructure behind the Johnston Bridge and the port bridge wing. The mast broke in half, and one of the radars, wire-coiled like a giant bedspring, toppled down. In the gun director, Hagen's seat collapsed, and he gashed his knee. He looked to the bridge below to see far worse. The pilot house was so riddled with shrapnel it looked like a kid's BB target. Men were lying in heaps, moaning and bleeding. Ellsworth Welch came in from the bridge wing to find Lieutenant Bechdel propped in the corner. Just a few minutes earlier, Bechdel had been exulting over his torpedoes running hot, straight and normal. Now he was complaining about his shoulder. He did not seem to notice that one of his legs had been blown off below the knee. The ship's doctor had given Welch some syrettes of morphine, and Welch wordlessly plunged one into Bechdel's wrist. Welch wasn't sure what else to do. He began collecting body parts and pitching them over the side to maintain morale, he later recalled. Bill Mercer had taken cover under the wing of the bridge. He heard someone yell from the bridge, "Stand by below!" A body was slowly lowered to the deck. As its torso came into view, Mercer realized the body was missing its head. The dead man was Lieutenant Plisker, the recognition officer. Robert Bieler was a lookout on the flying bridge above the pilot house. The explosion knocked him out. When he came to, he was lying by his shoes. A piece of shrapnel had struck his headphones, and his mouth was full of broken teeth and blood. My thoughts, he recalled, were what in the hell are we doing this for? Commander Evans seemed unfazed. His helmet had been blown off, his shirt ripped off his back, and his face and torso had been cut up by shrapnel. He was missing 2 fingers. The ship's doctor, Robert Brown, tried to attend to him, but he said, "Don't bother me now. Help some of those guys who are hurt," and wrapped a handkerchief around his bloody hand. Evans was taking stock of the damage. The gyroscope was knocked out, power was cut to the aft 3 guns, one of the engine rooms was wiped out, but the other engine was still working, which meant that the Johnston could still turn one of its 2 screws and make half speed. Steering was a problem. The steering cables had been cut. Warships are built with redundancy, however. It was possible to steer a destroyer by hand cranking the rudder shaft in the ship's stern. Evans ordered a party of sailors to be sent aft to man the cranks. He would communicate his steering orders by headphone from the bridge. A very few sailors cracked. A senior petty officer, normally a crew stalwart, crawled inside the signal flag bag, whimpering and gibbering. Others rallied. With the cables running aft severed, it was no longer possible to electronically control the aiming and firing of all 5 guns from Lieutenant Hagen's gun director. Robert Hollenbaugh, the Amish boy from Indiana, asked permission to fire Gun 54 in local control. Recalled Hollenbaugh, Gun 54 declared its own war on the Japanese. After the torpedo run, sailor Jim O'Gorick had left his station on the torpedo tubes and moved forward under the wing of the bridge, looking for some kind of cover. He was horrified when Lieutenant Plisker's severed head came rolling over the edge of the bridge and dropped into the sea before his eyes. But he snapped to and joined a repair party putting out a fire. It had begun to rain heavily. The water streaming into the scuppers was, O'Gorick could not help but notice, solid red, a mix of the dye used to mark the Japanese shells and blood. The Johnston had sailed into a merciful squall. Obscured from the enemy, the crew gained a 15-minute respite to make repairs and collect their wits. Hagen reached into his pocket for a cigarette. His pack was soaked. He felt more grateful than frustrated. The downpour was keeping them alive a few minutes longer. At 7:50 a.m., the Johnston emerged from the squall into a chaotic scene. Over the TBS, Admiral Sprague was ordering destroyers to form up for a torpedo attack. On the bridge, Quartermaster Third Class Neil Deathleys was manning the log. He had already inflated his life vest. He had been faithfully, if erratically, making log entries as the orders and shells flew. When he heard the order from the Taffy 3 commander for a torpedo attack, he thought, "Thank God we have already fired our torpedoes and won't have to go in there again." Evans had other ideas. DeGardi, the officer of the deck, was hoping to head south after the retreating jeep carriers, but Evans ordered the ship to come around and follow the other destroyers as they went in against the Japanese. "We'll provide fire support for the others," he said. Lieutenant Hagen protested. They were supposed to be guarding the carriers, not other destroyers. The officers debated for a moment. Hagen recalled that DeGardi joined in on his side of the argument, and the ship actually went around a full 360 degrees as the three men talked back and forth. If there was a moment's indecision by the captain, it was the only moment, and the Johnston was soon following two other destroyers, the Howell and the Heermann, and a destroyer escort, the Samuel B. Roberts, as they made their torpedo runs. The Johnston nearly collided with the Heermann as the two destroyers came barreling out of the smoke. A lookout cried out, and DeGardi ordered all engines back full, forgetting for a moment that the Johnston had lost one of its two engines. As the Johnston's single working screw bit into the water, the stern ploughed back into its wake. The two ships missed by no more than 20 feet. A cheer went up from the Johnston crew. The cheering died quickly. Less than 3 miles away was the Japanese battleship Congo. A single 14-inch gunshell detonating in the Johnston would sink her. It was not much consolation that the heavy armor-piercing shells were more likely to pass right through the thin metal skin of a tin can than explode. Survivors of the Johnston later speculated that the giant battleship could not depress her guns low enough to sink the low-riding destroyer. More likely, the Congo was firing over the Orson at the carriers beyond. Idle gun crews, whose guns had been destroyed or were useless against ships, had begun to huddle under the wing of the bridge, hoping they were safer there. It was an illusion. The thin metal over and around them just meant more shrapnel flying about if a shell struck nearby. A few crewmen looked for heavier metal and pitifully hid behind a large winch outside the bakery. Seeing the Japanese battleship and several cruisers and destroyers on both sides of the Johnston, a seaman called up to the bridge, "Let's get the hell out of here." In the gun director, Hagen was in a dreamy state, wrung out and detached. His guns had been peppering battleships and cruisers with 5-inch shells, but he didn't think they were doing much damage. The Johnston would fire 800 rounds over 3 hours, but it was like bouncing paper wads off a steel helmet, he recalled. At 8:30 a.m., Evans could see that one of the carriers, the Gambier Bay, was under heavy fire from a cruiser. "Commence firing on that cruiser, Hagen," Evans yelled up at his gunnery officer. "Draw her fire on us and away from the Gambier Bay." Hagen responded, "Aye, aye, sir," and said under his breath, "Surely you jest." From the bridge of the Johnston, it seemed that the Japanese were moving in for the kill. Evans spotted a cruiser and 4 destroyers closing in on the carriers, apparently commencing their torpedo run. The officers of the Johnston knew they were all alone. The destroyer Howell had vanished under a deluge of Japanese shells. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts was furiously burning a few miles away. Evans began giving orders to head off the 5 attacking ships. In so doing, historian Samuel E. Hott Morrison wrote, the Johnston signed her own death warrant. The Japanese cruiser was the Yahagi. The squadron commander aboard, Admiral Susumu Kimura, later wrote in his battle report, "Enemy destroyer plunged out of smokescreen on our port bow and opened gunfire and torpedo attack on us." The Johnston had no torpedoes, only 5-inch guns bravely banging away. In Gun 55, recalled gunner's mate 3rd Class Clint Carter, "We were firing so fast and so long that the paint on the gun barrel was blistered and on fire. The gunners couldn't get ammunition up fast enough from the handling room. I was screaming for ammo," recalled Carter, a Texan, when one of the sailors in the handling room screamed back, "I'm glad there are no Japanese from Texas." In the gun director, Hagen thought he could see hits on the Yahagi's superstructure. Then, he recalled, a most amazing thing happened. She turned 90 degrees right and broke off action. Yahagi executed right rudder, making wide evasive turn, at same time ordering destroyers to attack, recorded Admiral Kimura. Hagen opened up on the line of advancing destroyers. He realized, with pride and horror, that Captain Evans was trying to cross the T on the Japanese column, just as they taught at the War College, just as if he were Togo at Tsushima. Incredibly, the Japanese destroyers all turned 90 degrees and began to retreat. Commander Evans, feeling like the skipper of a battleship, was so elated he could hardly talk, recalled Hagen. He strutted across the bridge and chortled, "Now I've seen everything." The reality was only slightly less dramatic. The destroyers were turning to launch their torpedoes, but because of the Johnston improbable attack, the Japanese were forced to launch their fish while they were still more than 6 miles away from the nearest carrier, the Kalinin Bay. The torpedoes were moving so slowly by the time they reached the carriers that evasion was not difficult. One carrier, the Salo, deflected a torpedo from a collision course with a shot from its 5-inch gun. In classic Japanese fashion, Admiral Kimura compensated for failure with wild exaggeration to his superiors. In his action report, he reported, 3 enemy carriers and 1 cruiser were enveloped in black smoke and observed to sink one after another. There were no cruisers in Taffy 3, of course. In the squalls and smoke, Kurita's men had mistaken the American destroyers for Baltimore-class cruisers, which did have roughly the same silhouette as a destroyer, but were more than 4 times as heavy. But the men of the Johnston had no way of knowing that their David was being mistaken for Goliath. And at just about the time Commander Evans was improbably crossing the T of the Japanese destroyers, a sailor handed Lieutenant DeGardi, the officer of the deck, a message picked up off the Fox schedule from Manus. It was Admiral Kincaid desperately signalling Admiral Halsey, imploring him to send fast battleships to rescue the embattled Taffies, help needed from heavy ships immediately. DeGardi showed the message to Evans. It was at that point, DeGardi later recalled, that both men realized that Halsey was not coming to the rescue and that the fate of the Johnston was sealed. Admiral Kincaid was following the battle from inside his tiny sea cabin aboard his command ship, the Wasatch, in Leyte Gulf. Shortly after 7 a.m., Kincaid had been handed a message that Taffy 3 was under attack by major elements of the Japanese fleet. Kincaid immediately began firing off telegrams to Halsey. He sent an uncorded dispatch at 7:07 a.m., telling him that enemy battleships were firing on Clifton Ziggy Sprague's carrier task force off of the island of Samar. At 7:25 he wired Halsey that Admiral Oldendorf, who had just demolished the Japanese southern force in Surigao Strait, was low on ammo and thus could not be counted on to sail to the rescue. At 7:27 he more urgently requested that Halsey send Admiral Lee's fast battleships, the battle line that he had assumed would be guarding San Bernardino Strait, at top speed, while requesting an immediate strike by the planes of Halsey's fast carriers. With increasing franticness, Kincaid kept writing and sending messages. Situation critical, he cabled when the battle really began to turn dire around 8:30 a.m. None of these messages reached Halsey for at least an hour and a half after they were sent. They had to make their way through the overwhelmed radio operators at Manus. When Kincaid began bleating for help, he had not yet received Halsey's negative reply to his 4:12 a.m. message received by Halsey at 6:48 a.m., asking whether Task Force 34 was guarding San Bernardino Strait. "Staff work at its best," sarcastically wrote Ziggy Sprague in the margin of an early work on the battle. C. Van Woodward's 1947 The Battle for Leyte Cap to Ray Tarbuck, the naval officer assigned to General MacArthur's planning staff, and the only one to predict that the Japanese fleet would attack Leyte Gulf, had watched the Battle of Surigao Strait from the bridge of a command ship, the Blue Ridge. "Your prediction is coming true," said Admiral Dan Barbie, one of the amphibious force commanders, as they watched the big caliber gun flashes light up the sky after midnight. Now, in the light of day, with the news of Halsey's blunder and the sudden attack on Taffy 3, Barbie and the other commanders were fearful that Japanese battleships would soon be shooting at their ships as they sat moored in Leyte Gulf. Tarbuck went to see Admiral Kincaid in the Wasatch to see what the situation was, Tarbuck recalled. He found Kincaid sitting at his desk with his helmet pulled down. His helmet was too big for him, recalled Tarbuck. He was very worried and all shriveled up. There was nothing Kincaid could do. Halsey was more than 300 miles away. Admiral Kurita was winning the battle, but he couldn't tell. He had the speed and power to overwhelm the Taffies, but he didn't know it. After the first few salvos, the American ships had disappeared into squalls and smoke. Admiral Ugaki switched from visually sighting his guns to using radar, a new innovation on Japanese ships. Too late, the Japanese had given up faith in their superior eyesight. The newly installed radars had difficulty tracking the enemy. Even under the best of circumstances, it was difficult for a moving ship to get an accurate firing solution on another moving ship. After the battle, Kurita would ruefully admit that the shooting by his great fleet had been poor. Shortly before 8 a.m., a lookout on the Yamato warned of torpedo tracks coming out of the smoke. A destroyer, probably the Heermann, had fired off all her fish at the Japanese flagship. The basic evasive maneuver for a ship faced with multiple torpedo tracks is to comb them, to sail parallel rather than broadside. The Yamato swung her mighty bow to comb the tracks, now 6 torpedo wakes, 4 on one side, 2 on the other. But the great ship turned north, away from the battle, not south. She was forced to run along with the torpedoes until their alcohol fuel burned out and they sank. The detour took 10 minutes, but it felt like a month, recorded Ugaki. In his diary, he insisted that the turn had been taken at the direction of the commander-in-chief, i.e., on Kurita's command. Normally, such maneuvers are the preserve of the ship's captain, not the fleet commander. Kurita later blamed the ship's captain, Admiral Nobue Morishita. Most naval officers preferred to comb torpedoes by turning the bow first toward the torpedo wakes, in part because the bow has more armor than the stern, where the highly vulnerable rudder is located. Turning away and presenting the ship's stern was a notably non-aggressive maneuver. By the time the Yamato turned around and rejoined the chase, she had fallen 7 miles behind the pack. A stern chase in Navy law is a long chase, and the constant need to maneuver to avoid attacking planes and the torpedo attacks of the American destroyers slowed and spread the Japanese fleet. Nonetheless, the gap between hunter and hunted closed in the second hour of battle, between the hours of 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. The constant deluge of heavy-caliber shells on the Japanese destroyers and carriers began to tell. The advancing Kurita fleet slowly enveloped the taffy stragglers. The carrier Gambier Bay was listing and on fire when the Yamato drew near shortly after 8:30 a.m. Kurita could have finished off the small carrier with the battleship's great guns, but he chose not to. The Gambier Bay was done for. There was no point in pouring more shells into her except to kill more of her men. Instead, Kurita gave the order to the crew of the Yamato to line the rails. Men from the engine room were permitted to come on deck to see the sight of the burning American carrier. From his perch on the Yamato superstructure, lookout Koitabashi could see men with fire hoses vainly spraying down the deck of the stricken American carrier. At the time, Koitabashi wondered about his admiral's choice not to open fire at such close range. He later reflected that Kurita was not a man to kill unnecessarily. A couple of miles away, pilot Henry Pizdrovsky was wondering if the Japanese meant to capture the Gambier Bay as a prize. He felt the .38 pistol in his holster and survival knife in his belt and wondered, are we going to have to repel boarders? He decided that as a boy he had read too many sea stories from the age of fighting sail. Pizdrovsky wasn't the only officer to feel as if he had been dropped back in the age of gunwale-to-gunwale sea battles. If we get any closer, thought Lieutenant Hagen aboard his destroyer as they closed within 4,000 yards of an enemy cruiser, you're going to have to get my sword. Pizdrovsky had missed his chance to fly off the deck of the Gambier Bay. In the opening moments of the battle, he had watched, with awe, as Lieutenant Gallagher took his plane, its fuel tanks nearly empty, and charged right at the Japanese. Pizdrovsky had expected to follow shortly, but before he could launch his Avenger, the ship turned and ran south and southwest, downwind. Carrier planes can only take off into the wind, so Pizdrovsky was left stranded. Quick-thinking Admiral Sprague was leading the Japanese on a roundabout but purposeful chase, first to the east to launch planes, then veering south and southwest in the direction of hoped for help. Kurita sailed straight east to try to cut off the Americans to windward, then turned and followed. The superior speed of his ships slowly allowed them to gain on the Americans, despite the twisting and turning to dodge the brave counterattacks of the American destroyers. Look at the little destroyer escort committing rashness, Mac, one of Sprague's lieutenants, had remarked to a fellow officer as they watched the attack of the little fellas from the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay. Without any duty station, Pzdrowski stood on the flight deck, a spectator to acts of astonishing bravery. A Japanese cruiser, the Chikuma, had zeroed in on the Gambier Bay, and her 8-inch armor-piercing shells began to cut holes in the Kaiser coffin's thin deck. Many of them went right through, like a bullet through a shoebox, but others detonated. Wondering if he could be useful, Pzdrowski went to the ship's sickbay. It had been gutted by a shell. The beheaded body of the ship's surgeon lay in a corner. Recoiling, Pzdrowski went to his cabin. His locker, where he kept his liquor, was open and empty. He had shouted the combination to his roommate, Lieutenant Bisbee, as he had waited to take off, and now he found Bisbee and several others, crouched amidst a litter of empty Scotch bottles beneath a teepee of mattresses. As the order to abandon ship squawked over the PA, the pilots stumbled on deck. On the way, Pzdrowski encountered a pilot who had been badly burned and was near death. The man held up his hand. Pzdrowski was unsure why. Then he realized what the man wanted. As gently as he could, he removed the man's wedding ring and promised to bring it to his wife. Then, as the Gambier Bay burned and began to roll over, the pilot jumped into the sea. Shortly before 9 a.m., the American planes, which had been attacking in groups of 2 and 3, began arriving in waves. Some of the Taffy 3 pilots were making dummy runs. After he exhausted his bombs and ammo, Lieutenant Thomas Lupo of New Orleans threw a Coke bottle at a Japanese warship as he flew over. Lieutenant Earl Blue Archer of Hope, Arkansas, took out his .38 caliber service revolver and fired a few shots into the superstructure of a battleship. But other, better-armed planes from Taffy 2 were entering the fray, dropping torpedoes and heavier bombs. 2 of Kurita's cruisers, the Chokai and Chikuma, were hit so badly they were dead in the water. Chokas began to sink. Kurita was sure that these air attacks presaged even heavier ones. He and his chief of staff, Admiral Koyanagi, were convinced that they were surrounded, chasing one carrier group to the south, but in turn being shadowed by an American carrier group to the north. Japanese radio operators had intercepted Admiral Kincaid's call to Admiral Halsey for help, sent in the clear in plain English. The same message that convinced Commander Evans and Lieutenant Hagen aboard the Johnston that they were doomed, that Halsey would never make it in time, gave no encouragement to Kurita. The Japanese understood the message to mean that Halsey was within 2 hours of catching up with Kurita, that by the time Kurita finished battling one carrier group, he would have to turn and fight another. Perhaps Kurita should have read the desperation in Kincaid's messages, but he was desperate himself. Far from seeing that he was on the verge of wiping out a group of jeep carriers, he felt surrounded, sure that he was caught in a vice. His fears were not unwarranted. Kurita's ships were running low on fuel and ammunition. He had already lost half his fleet. In the 2 hours since the battle began, 4 of his cruisers had been hit so hard by American planes or destroyers that they had to drop out of the battle. When Kurita left Brunei, his fleet included 10 heavy cruisers and 2 light cruisers. Now, after 2 days under assault, only 2 heavy and 2 light cruisers remained to fight. He faced the real prospect that if he continued this running battle, none of his ships, none of the 32 warships that left Brunei, would return home. Standing behind his commander-in-chief on the bridge of the Yamato, Admiral Koyanagi had shed his brief faith in miracles. The fight seemed chaotic to him. Radio communications were poor as usual, and after the flagship had turned around to evade the torpedoes, she had lost sight of some of her own fleet. Koyanagi felt uneasy in the dark, he later recalled. Still believing that his ships were chasing fleet carriers that could make 30 knots, and not jeep carriers poking along at 18 knots, he didn't know that the Japanese were on the verge of overrunning the Americans. He wasn't sure how the battle was progressing, or what they were truly up against, and he was troubled by the nagging sense that they had been tricked, led into a trap. The Chief of Staff whispered into the Commander-in-Chief's ear. "Let's discontinue this chase," Koyanagi recalled saying. "There's still Leyte to attack." Kurita did not need any persuading. He gave the order. The fleet was to reassemble around the Yamato, heading north, away from the Americans and away also from Leyte Gulf. It was about 9:15 a.m. Lookout Koitabashi was on the wing of the bridge when the word was passed. There was the usual communications breakdown. Koitabashi watched as the cruiser tone continued to forge ahead, seeming to ignore the signal. The officers on the bridge looked rather puzzled, recalled Koitabashi. Some were quietly grumbling, wondering why Kurita had broken off the chase. "We have to assemble and make a formation to go into Leyte," one of the officers explained. At 9:30 a.m. the giant battleship swung north. She was relatively unscratched. A single 5-inch shell from a destroyer had landed in a rice locker. The shell was a dud. The men on the bridge of Ziggy Sprague's flagship, the Hanshaw Bay, were giddy with disbelief. "God damn it, boys, they're getting away," yelled a signalman near Admiral Sprague. Sure enough, they could see Japanese warships around them breaking off the engagement and sailing north. The Admiral let out a whoop. "I could not believe my eyes," Sprague wrote, but it looked as if the whole Japanese fleet was indeed retiring. At best, I had expected to be swimming by this time, along with all my crews. It was too late for the Johnston. A whole flotilla of Japanese destroyers had prematurely launched their torpedoes when Commander Evans crossed their bows shortly before 9 a.m. Now they turned on the wounded American ship with a vengeance. Even after Kurita gave his signal to withdraw and reassemble, the destroyers kept firing into the Johnston, circling her like Indians around Custer. The Japanese destroyers were firing at point-blank range. The trajectory of their shells was so flat that Lieutenant Jesse Cochran, the junior engineering officer, saw holes in the port and starboard sides of the aft engine compartment where shells had entered and exited without exploding. The forward engine and fire compartments were in shambles from shell hits at 7:30 a.m. Incredibly, survivors had hid in the bilge, between the skin of the ship and the engine room filled with scalding steam. After about an hour, they emerged like ghosts. Machinist's mate third-class Robert Sochor recalled one of them shaking like a dog, as if to get the hot, steaming clothes off his skin. Sochor helped the men to the officers' wardroom where the ship's doctor was trying to do what he could. "It was an awful sight to see," recalled Sochor, all those pathetic men sitting and lying on the crowded deck. The ship's doctor, Robert Brown, was trying to put life jackets on the wounded. At about 9:10 a.m., a shell hit one of the forward guns, knocking it out and igniting its 40mm ammunition, which began popping off just below the bridge. Lieutenant Welch, sent aft by the captain to check on a gun that had stopped firing, returned to find the bridge deserted. Welch described the eerie scene. The ship drove under the spray of a near hit of dye-loaded shells. Reddish water cascaded over the deck, evaporating instantly from the heat of a magazine on fire from the deck below. Suffocating smoke blew over the bridge. Classified publications were gone. The bridge had become uninhabitable. Commander Evans had ordered the bridge detail to evacuate. The captain told Lieutenant DeGardi, the ship's communications officer, to destroy all the Johnston's codebooks and classified information. DeGardi took 3 men into the radio shack, where everyone was dead, and blew up the coding machine with a grenade. He emptied a safe full of classified documents into a mattress cover, put in a 5-inch shell casing for weight, and threw it over the side. Leaving the abandoned bridge, Lieutenant Welch found the captain standing on the fantail. He was shouting orders down the hatch into the aft steering room, where sailors pulled and pushed, like ancient galley slaves, to manually shift the rudder. Gunner's mate second-class Jim Herring had been standing in the spotter's hatch of gun 55, the aft-most 5-inch gun, when he saw the skipper pull open the deck hatch to the aft steering room and start bellowing orders. Evans's shirt was almost burned off his back. It hung in tatters. He was smeared with blood from his wounds, and his hand was wrapped in a blood-soaked handkerchief. He was standing beneath the barrel of gun 55, which barked and flashed every few seconds. This didn't seem to faze him, recalled Herring, who was moved by the sight of his captain, bloodied and defiant, a figure out of a lost age. Evans might as well have been John Paul Jones, personally aiming a 9-pounder cannon at the British from the ravaged quarterdeck of the Bonhomme Richard a century and a half before. His guts and determination to whip the Japanese, single-handed it seemed, kept me from really being scared, Herring recalled. It just made you want to help him whip the hell out of them too. The Johnston had impossibly survived for over 2 hours, but her luck was running out. A Japanese shell smashed into the forward fire room, knocking out the boilers. The starboard screw stopped turning. The Johnston lay dead in the water. Flames were shooting up the forward superstructure. Only a single gun was firing, and its ammo was down to star shells. There was nothing more that Evans could do. He gave the order to pass the word, "Abandon ship." In the gun director, so smoke filled his men were choking, Lieutenant Hagen said, "What the hell are we doing here? Let's abandon ship." The last word was hardly out of my mouth when his men scrambled past him and headed for the rail. Hagen started aft to look for the captain, but his way was blocked. The dead and dying were stacked amidships, a mound of torn and anguished flesh. "Please help me," a man called out. Hagen looked at the man who was larger than he and whose legs were horribly mangled. "I can't," replied Hagen. Hagen walked forward and, like a man in a dream, carefully took off his shoes and socks and dove over the side. Men were jumping and clambering off the ship. De Gardy stopped to try to help Lieutenant Bechdel, the torpedo officer whose leg had been blown off below the knee. Dr. Brown had dressed the stump, but Bechdel was so weak from shock and morphine that De Gardy had to lift him over the side. A shell hit and blew De Gardy right out of his socks and shoes into the water 30 feet from the ship. The scene in the water was at once panicky and surreal. Jim O'Gorick, Hagen's torpedo man, swam over and said to him, Hagen recalled, as brightly as if he was meeting me on the street corner, "Mr. Hagen, we got off all 10 of them torpedoes, and they ran hot, straight and normal." As they bobbed on the swell, Bill Mercer watched a sailor named Bob Marquard pull his comb from his pocket, neatly part his hair, and throw away the comb, saying, "I don't guess I'll ever need that again." Messroom steward Robert Bandy cried, "Someone help me! I can't swim!" Someone yelled that now is a good time to learn, and Bandy, a large black man, must have, because he was the only steward's mate to survive. Charles Landreth had left his life jacket hanging on his bunk when he ran to his battle station in the engine room. Jumping into the water, he tried to hang on to another sailor who did have his life jacket, but the man fought him off. Landreth told the man that if he made it out alive, he would get him. Treading water, Hagen saw Dr. Brown, who was his roommate, carrying wounded men out of the deckhouse and laying them on the deck. Hagen called out to Brown, "Abandon ship!" Brown yelled back something and turned to go back into the wardroom, charnel house, when a shell obliterated him. Hagen's eyes filled with tears. He wept for 30 seconds, tried to get control of himself and started swimming away, worried that he would be sucked down when the ship sank. The Johnston, by now a blackened hulk of twisted metal, was beginning to settle by the bow as a Japanese destroyer circled and pumped shells into her. "There she goes!" a swimmer cried out, and the Johnston, home for 330 men living cheek to cheek for the past year, rolled over and began to sink, until only her fantail could be seen. With a last rumble and sigh, she disappeared into the depths of the Philippine Sea. Tom Dixon, a fuse setter in Gun 54, began to cry. So did Lieutenant Welch. He had been ducking underwater whenever he saw the Japanese destroyer open fire, but because he was wearing a life jacket, he could only get the upper part of his body below water. "I must have looked like a duck feeding on food below," he recalled. His eyes brimming, he tried to stop crying. He thought to himself that his body might need the liquid. A Japanese destroyer slowly moved in amongst the ship's survivors. About 60 of the crew had been killed in battle and gone down with the ship. Some 270 survivors, many badly wounded, drifted in the oil slicks amidst the flotsam. At first, the men of the Johnston were convinced that they would be machine-gunned or depth-charged as they floated helplessly. The Japanese warship, flying an enormous rising sun battle flag, drew within 100 yards of the swimmers. Japanese sailors lined the rail. They were not holding guns. Some clapped and laughed or made a number 1 sign. One tossed a can of tomatoes. Then several of the Johnston sailors noticed the destroyer captain, in his white uniform, standing on the wing of the bridge. The officer gravely saluted. The Japanese steamed away. Hagen recalled the sudden silence. Guns were no longer crashing, machinery was no longer roaring, wounded were no longer screaming. They were alone on a vast sea. Captain Evans was nowhere to be seen. No one had seen him leave the ship. He had simply vanished beneath the waves. Some 400 miles to the north, Admiral Halsey was plunging from euphoria to anger and depression. While the Taffies had been running for their lives from Kurita's opening salvos, Halsey impatiently waited for his planes to strike Ozawa's carriers. At 8:03 a.m., Halsey's restless staff heard a pilot cry out over the radio frequency broadcast into flag plot, "I have the target in sight." Waves of Third Fleet warplanes dove down through anti-aircraft fire at Ozawa's 4 carriers, desperately zigzagging on the blue sea below. Halsey's climactic battle had finally begun. But at 8:22 a.m., an ominous message arrived. It was from Admiral Kincaid in Leyte Gulf. The 7th Fleet commander was passing on a report from Admiral Sprague of Taffy 3 that Japanese warships were 15 miles astern and firing on him. This was the first warning that Kincaid had sent out, at 7:07 a.m. Thanks to the circuitous radio traffic, it was reaching Halsey over an hour later. Standing by the intelligence staff's stand-up desk in flag plot, Lieutenant Solberg understood right away that the dour Mike Cheek and Solberg's roommate, Harris Cox, had been prescient. The battleships of the Japanese center force had come right through the unguarded San Bernardino Strait and were now like wolves among the sheep. Solberg noted that the formerly unshakable Doug Moulton, who had been so adamant about going after the carriers with everything they had the night before, was now looking not quite so sure of himself. In his memoirs, Halsey insisted that, at first, he was not worried by Kincaid's message. He assumed, he wrote, that the 16 small carriers of the Taffies could muster enough air power to hold off Kurita's damaged force until Admiral Oldendorf's battleships of the 7th Fleet could sail up to relieve them. Halsey gave no thought to turning around. This was not the time to hesitate. Here he was, on the verge of a victory that he believed would finish off the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force, and hence eliminate Japan's most lethal weapon, hastening an end to the war. Halsey felt his determination rewarded when, at 8:50 a.m., Admiral Mitcher signalled the first returns from the airstrikes. 2 carriers had been hit, and a third, a light carrier, had already exploded and sunk. But the messages kept coming, much delayed, out of order, but revealing increasing desperation by Kincaid. Request fast carriers make immediate strike. Kincaid had radioed at 7:27 a.m., and Halsey finally received at 9 a.m. Halsey was sufficiently moved to order Admiral McCain's carrier task force to attack center force. But McCain's carriers were still hundreds of miles away, rushing back from their diversion to replenish at Ulithi, and McCain's planes could not arrive before early afternoon. Halsey acknowledged that he became angrier and admitted that he was shaken when Kincaid informed him at 9:22 a.m. that Oldendorf's old battleships were low in ammunition. Here was a new factor, so astonishing that I could hardly accept it. Why hadn't Kincaid let me know before? Halsey spluttered in his memoirs. He protested too much. Halsey could have guessed that Oldendorf's ships might be depleted after sinking the Japanese southern force in Surigao Strait, and in any case, the failure of communication was mutual. Halsey's equivocations and rationalizations in his memoirs, as he described this terrible scene, verge on the pathetic. But denial may have been the only way he could have coped with the shock of his blunder revealed at the precise moment of his greatest triumph. Observing his commander as the messages flowed in that morning, Solberg noticed that Halsey's face was ashen. John Marshall, Solberg's fellow air combat intelligence officer, watched Halsey sitting in stubborn silence on the leather bench he often occupied in flag plot. Marshall recalled, suddenly, to no one in particular, but as if talking to himself, he muttered, "When I get my teeth into something, I hate to let go." At 10 a.m., 2 more messages arrived. The first shocked Halsey. TT was from Kincaid. "My situation is critical. Fast battleships and support by airstrikes may be able to keep enemy from destroying CVS and entering Leyte." The second message was from Admiral Nimitz, and it would make Halsey so upset that he wept. Thousands of miles away, in Hawaii and Washington, the top brass of the United States Navy anxiously followed the progress of the battle by wireless telegraph. The senior officers at the Pentagon had their opinions about what Halsey should do, or should have done. On the night of the 24th, when it appeared that Kurita was coming through the San Bernardino Strait, Adame. Raymond Spruance looked at the chart of the battle area. He placed his hand on a spot just to the east of the strait. "If I were there," he said, as if to himself. I would keep my force right there. But he was not there. Spruance was back at Pearl, waiting his turn to take control of the Big Blue Fleet after New Year's. He knew enough not to suggest that Halsey be ordered to keep the Third Fleet on guard off the strait. Indeed, he knew that he, along with all the admirals in the Pacific Fleet, as well as those gold-braided flat hats back in Washington, would not even suggest that Halsey hold back his fleet. It was the Navy way, born of hundreds of years of naval tradition, that commanders at sea in the midst of battle must be allowed to decide for themselves what to do without meddling from the Admiralty on land. The tradition was born partly of necessity. In the pre-electronic age, captains had been isolated and controlled only by flag signals from their fleet admirals. If that ordered by the fleet admiral's flag signal to break off his attack on Copenhagen in 1803, Admiral Nelson is said to have clapped his telescope to his blind eye and exclaimed, "I really cannot see the signal." Then he proceeded to destroy the Danish fleet. Halsey, glorified in the newspapers as America's Nelson, was on his own. He would not be second-guessed. "He was stunned as if I had been struck in the face," recalled Halsey. "The paper rattled in my hands. I snatched off my cap, threw it on the deck, and shouted something I am ashamed to remember." Halsey, to the utter astonishment of his staff and the enlisted men standing around watching this spectacle, let out an anguished sob. Horrified, Mick Carney rushed over and grabbed my arm, Halsey recalled. "Stop it!" yelled Carney like a mother to a teenage boy. "What the hell's the matter with you? Pull yourself together!" Halsey handed him the dispatch and turned his back. He was speechless. "It was utterly impossible for me to believe that Chester Nimitz would send me such an insult," he recalled. Halsey was not done with his tantrum. He grabbed the dispatch from Carney, hurled it to the floor, and stomped on it. "What right does Chester have to send me a goddamn message like that?" He implored no one in particular. Then he wheeled and went down the steps to his cabin. Carney anxiously followed. It will never be known exactly what was said down there. Neither man discussed the conversation in his memoir. But the conversation must have been excruciating. When Halsey emerged an hour later, he gave the order to turn around, to change course from due north to due south. The battle line was less than 2 hours from Ozawa's carriers and their escorts, or, as Halsey put it, exactly 42 miles from the muzzles of my 16-inch guns. The New Jersey could have led the way into an old-fashioned and extremely one-sided sea battle, blasting away at the remnants of Ozawa's fleet. But with glory in his grasp, Halsey had no choice but to open his hand and let it slip away. Nimitz's telegram had been intended as a nudge, but to Halsey it felt like a sledgehammer blow. He felt obliged to turn around and sail toward Later Gulf. The chances of his getting there in time to do any good were very low. He did not expect his fleet to arrive at Later until 8 a.m. the next morning. Halsey would never recover from the bitterness he felt. "I turned my back on the opportunity I had dreamed about since my days as a cadet," he wrote after the war. October 25, 1944, was the last day of the Great Fleets. It was also the first day of the suicide bombers. Lieutenant Yukio Seki had been trying to die for the past 5 days. He was the commander of the Shikishima unit of the Special Attack, or Shimpu Squadron. Shikishima is an ancient holy name for Japan, like Yamato. Seki was an Etajima graduate, recognized as a natural leader. Approached about leading the first kamikaze unit, he had closed his eyes, run his hands through his long hair, looked up and said, in an unfaltering voice, "You absolutely must let me do it." On October 20th, at a remote airfield on the Philippine island of Luzon, he had stood proudly in front of his 24-man squad, letting to Admiral Onishi, the commander of the 1st Air Force and the creator of the kamikazes. "You are already gods without earthly desires," Onishi told his men, his voice quaking with emotion. "But one thing you want to know is that your own crash dive is not in vain. Regrettably, we will not be able to tell you the results, but I shall watch your efforts to the end and report your deeds to the throne." Young Lieutenant Seki had led his men in song. "If I go away to sea, I shall return a corpse awash. If duty calls me to the mountain, a verdant sword will be my pall. Thus, for the sake of the Emperor, I will not die peacefully at home." Seki's men were all volunteers. One of them had already labelled his bag "Personal Effects of the late Lieutenant Commander Naoshi Kano." They had flown off that day looking for American ships to plunge into, but couldn't find any. For the next 4 days, they had dodged around heavy rainstorms, fruitlessly searching for the Americans. Even Lieutenant Seki, who was suffering from severe diarrhea, was becoming demoralized. Finally, after 10 a.m. on October 25th, good tidings arrived. An American carrier group had been spotted 50 miles east of Leyte. Once more, Lieutenant Seki affixed his hachimaki bandana and prepared to meet his fate. The carrier group was Taffy 3, still celebrating its narrow escape from Kurita's gunships. The men of Taffy 3 were wrung out and giddy over their good luck. Aboard one of Taffy 3's 6 CVEs, the Sis Low, the captain had just ordered Condition 1 easy, allowing half the crew to stand down from general quarters and get a cup of coffee. Suddenly, the crew saw a lone Japanese Zeke fighter, with bombs hanging under each wing, flying flat and low, coming at the stern, almost as if the plane was lining up a landing. The plane was about a half-mile away. It was Lieutenant Seki. He jerked back on the stick, brought up the nose of his plane, and then plunged straight down. The plane hit the flight deck and exploded in a fireball. The burning fuselage smashed right through the 4-inch thick wooden deck and came to rest amidst a stack of torpedoes and bombs. The ensuing blasts, 7 of them, peeled back the flight deck, threw pieces of the carrier as high as 1,000 feet into the air, and knocked the Seslo on her beam ends. She was gone in 15 minutes. Seki was one of a dozen kamikaze pilots to dive on targets that day, though the only one to actually sink a ship. A new era of warfare had begun. Before it was over, 3,912 Japanese airmen would kill themselves for the Emperor. Seki's eagerness was typical of special attack pilots, at least at that early state of the kamikaze campaign. Kamikazes believed that they were honoring the ancient tradition of Bushido, the way of the warrior. Their instructors had told them that throughout Japan's long history of invincibility, true warriors welcomed the chance to sacrifice themselves for the emperor, whatever the cost. This, then, was the essence of Bushido. Warriors were not merely willing to die for the chrysanthemum throne, they wanted to die. Bushido was a powerful motivator, but it was, as historian Carl Friday has written, bull. Ancient samurai were no more eager to die than warriors of other civilizations. Japanese soldiers were told that if they were captured, they would be shamed forever. But many ancient Japanese warriors had been prisoners of war. Indeed, the first of the great shoguns, Ieyasu Tokugawa, had been captured and released by his enemies without opprobrium. The notion of absolute loyalty to the emperor was also a fiction. In medieval times, a samurai's loyalty to his lord was largely personal, a contract that could be broken, and often was. Even the term Bushido was a contrivance. Rarely used in ancient times, it was popularized by military leaders in the early Meiji era, the 1870s, to stiffen the morale and discipline of raw conscripts. The young men in kamikaze squadrons had no way of knowing they were being cynically manipulated. Even graduates of Etajima had been fed a highly idealized history of the warrior tradition. The navy men were not, on the whole, as credulous and fanatical as the officers of the Imperial Japanese Army. But many were like Admiral Ugaki, true believers in the myth of Bushido. Admiral Kurita knew better. His early education, at the knee of his father, a scholar of the early Meiji period, had been exceptional, more humanistic, more sophisticated, more realistic. Kurita's own children remembered him urging them to read his grandfather's scholarly texts. Interviewed in 2004, Kurita's daughter, Shigeko Terada, recalled that she resisted. The tomes were written in ancient Chinese characters and very difficult to read. But it was clear to her that her father had been affected by his own family's scholarship. Kurita's grandfather had been a famous scholar of ancient Japan. He was heavily influenced by the Confucianism of the ancients, borrowed from the Chinese more than a millennium before the Meiji Restoration. Confucianism, not Bushido, was the real Kurita family ideology. Confucianism stressed loyalty and obedience, as well as decency to others. For Kurita, the obligation of loyalty caused a tremendous conflict. Loyalty to whom? To his emperor, surely. But he could not be sure what the emperor truly wanted, for his will was interpreted and twisted by the senior military at Imperial General Headquarters. Kurita felt the pull of obligation to his superiors, but also to the men under his authority and to his own family, and lastly, to himself, to his own sense of honor and right and wrong. It was not uncommon for Japanese of this age or any age to feel a tremendous sense of tension from conflicting obligations. The pressure of reconciling the irreconcilable can be strangely enervating, almost paralyzing. It is the theme of many popular tragedies, and it was almost surely a cause of the tragedy facing Kurita. Did he sacrifice his men to obey his superiors, even if he thought his superiors were sending them on a hopeless, futile mission? In Japan, there is an expression for feeling overwhelmed by stress, conflict, and fatigue. Atama ga mashiro ni naru. It means literally seeing white in one's head, as if in a fog bank or a whiteout in a snowstorm. As Admiral Kurita sailed the warm tropical waters of the Philippine Sea, his brain was befogged, benumbed by a blizzard of conflicting obligations.